My great grandpa was a mercantile person, owned lots of property and whatever back in New York, and he heard about coming out to the Indian Territory when Oregon and Washington were Oregon Territory. And so he decided that they could come by covered wagon, but they had a lot of really fine furnishings, and he wanted to open up a mercantile store in the Oregon Territory, which turned out to be Astoria, Oregon. And they had a really wonderful piano, and so he decided that the best way to come would be to take the ship and go around the Horn, which is around South America. That was before they had the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
So they got the piano on the ship, and he was on the ship, and the ship steward or whomever was in charge said, "Oh, we can't take any more of you. We can take you, and we can take your furnishings, but that's it." So my grandpa had to put my great grandmother and my grandmother and her sister in this wagon train that was heading to St. Louis. So my great grandpa, headed out, and I don't know the history of their travels to St. Louis, and I don't know their history until they got into the Oregon Territory, which is now Walla Walla, and they ended up in Rosalia, Washington, and my great grandpa ended up in Astoria, Oregon, which is now Astoria, Oregon. And so they were separated for about 2 years, and then he found out where they were, and they had lived through a lot of Indian uprisings during that time, and there was I've forgotten what it was called. I think it was like the Walla Walla Massacre or Whitman Massacre, I think maybe it was called. Anyway, they were spared that. They were not in close proximity to that, and my great grandpa came to Rosalia, found them, and took them to Astoria, Oregon. And he had quite the business sense about him. And so he owned a big, what they called mercantile store, which is like a general store, which is today would be like a combination of a department grocery store. And they lived on a hillside in Astoria, Oregon that overlooked the Columbia River at the mouth where it goes into the Pacific Ocean. They lived there for quite some time, and they had 2 other daughters, so they had 4 daughters. Then he heard that up in the Washington Territory, by Everett, that there was a lot of possibilities to become really rich. So he moved his family up there. And about that time, Ford Motor Company, probably weren't called Ford Motor, but similar, were selling Model A Fords, and my great grandfather bought one. However, that didn't hold very many people, and so it was a very long trip to get up to Everett area, which is now Everett. And so he took some of the family, then he came back and he got the rest of the family, and it took them about a month to move to what is now called Everett, Washington. So in Everett, Washington, he had a grocery store on the corner of Rockefeller and 21st Street. And after I was born in 1939, I spent a lot of time up in that area. My great grandpa had built a house for my grandmother, who became a widow as my grandpa died in the First World War, leaving 3 small children. So my grandmother never remarried, so she lived downstairs with her 3 children, and my great grandmother lived upstairs in this grocery store, above this, in this apartment, in this house. And the grocery store, when my great grandpa died, my great grandmother sold, and it became an apartment building. But my whole childhood growing up was going back and forth to my grandma's and my great grandmother's house, and they had this piano that came around the horn. was up in my great-grandmother's apartment, and she taught me how to play. I was not very good. I never took lessons. I was too impatient to sit there for very long. But that piano has traveled throughout our family for years and years and years, and now one of my granddaughters has it. And so that's their story. And on my father's side, my great-grandfather came from Germany after the First World War, before the First World War, and came to California. And he lived in San Francisco, and he married, and my grandpa was also, on my father's side, a mercantile person. And he had a grocery store, mercantile store, in Long Beach, California. He also had, whenever the first cars came out, had a car. They had 5 children, my father being the oldest son. Every year they spent 6 months in Long Beach, California, and 6 months in Harrington, Washington, which is a German farming community in eastern Washington. When my father grew up, he spoke only German at home, and at school he spoke English, and he refused, when us kids were growing up, there were 5 of us, he refused to let us learn German, which to this day is sad, because that would have been great to have learned that language. But when I was a small child, every Sunday, and we didn't have a car, but my father's sister did, and her husband, and we would travel to Snohomish, which was about 8 miles from Everett, to the German Lutheran Church in Snohomish. And the whole service was in German, and then afterwards they had a potluck dinner, and you were there from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night, and I thoroughly loved it. But my father, because he moved so much as a young child from California to eastern Washington, when he married my mother, he said, "We're going to buy a house and we're never moving again, and I don't expect to do any traveling." So he pretty much lived by that, and the only time my father traveled by car only was to go to Odessa or Harrington, Washington, in eastern Washington, for funerals or weddings.
Oh, so if you didn't learn German and you went to a German church, could you understand any of it, or were you just sitting there?
I knew not. I know, and I was too young. It was before I went to kindergarten, so I was pretty young when we went there every Sunday. My mother refused to go. My mother belonged to the First Congregationalist Church. My grandmother belonged to the First Congregational Church, and my great-grandmother belonged to an Episcopalian church. So I had all of these 4 churches as my background, and I became a reorganized Latter-day Saint. There was a church that offered a Bible school down about 4 blocks from our house. And so I went down there and took my sister with me to Vacation Bible School, and then consequently my mother joined, and so we quit going over to Snohomish. And my mother never did go, but my sister and I, and so we went to that church until I moved away from home.
Okay, so what church did you say that your great-grandmother was part of?
Episcopalian.
What does that happen to be?
It's the Episcopalian Church is between a Lutheran church and a Catholic church. It's a very sedate, quiet church, old hymns, very rigid, lots of scripture reading, and very quiet, and no songs that were like fast or fun, and no one ever said amen after anything, and you really had to dress up to go to that church. Every woman wore a hat and their best clothing. When I was little, one Sunday I would go to my great-grandmother's church. mean, she would just be dressed to a T with gloves and hat and dress and heels. And other than during the Second World War when they couldn't have nylons, she always had nylons. And my grandmother went to the First Congregationalist Church, which was still more severe than the Lutheran Church, but not quite as sedate as the Episcopalian Church. And so they laughed a little bit. But at my great-grandmother's church, you would never, I don't ever remember anyone smiling or greeting you or whatever. It was very solemn, and my grandmother's church was a little happier, and they would have potluck dinners and whatever, and do some socializing. But the church I grew up in, then down the street from me, they had lots of activities for kids, and they didn't believe in dancing or drinking or smoking or dating until you were 18. But they had lots of other fun activities. We did camping. There was a place out on south of Everett that was a lake called Silver Lake, and our church had a campgrounds there. And every summer I would spend a month out there. So those were growing up years that were fun. But my whole growing up years were involved with one church or another.
So do you know how your great-grandparents' experiences were in the war?
Well, my grandfather, I don't know about my great-grandpa. I think he was in between ages for the First World War, which was 1916 to 18. But my grandpa, my mother's father, they lived in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. He was an engineer, and he was instrumental in bringing the railroad from the Midwest out to Washington and to the Pacific Ocean. And so he was college educated, and he was knowing that he was going to be going into the war because it was the First World War. And my mother was the oldest, born in 1913. My uncles were 1914 and 1915. So my grandmother had 3 children under the age of 3 when my grandpa went off to the First World War over in Germany. And he never came home. And but while he was in the service, we think that he divorced my grandmother. But we don't know all that history. She never told us, and so we don't know what exactly happened. But there's 2 schools of thought on that. One is that he died in the war, and the other is that he died in Astoria, Oregon. So we don't know which story is true, because my grandmother was very closed mouth and whatever, and never divulged that. None of us knew. But we did find some letters from my grandpa during that First World War, and that he'd sent to my grandmother. And when he was in France, and when he got there, and it took forever for them to get any kind of a mail thing. It's not like it is today that you can get a letter in a couple days. So we've only seen a couple of those.
Okay. And that was on your
My mother's side.
Mom's side?
Mm-hmm.
So were your grandparents or great-grandparents on your dad's side in the war?
No. Probably some of my father's relatives, but my great-grandpa came to the United States to San Francisco. And so my grandpa, my dad's father, was probably in the California area and wasn't old enough to be in the war. I think he was born sometime before that. I'm not clear on that. Anyway, he was never in the war. My father was born in 1908. So my grandpa, I don't know why he wouldn't have been I guess he was too. They were all too old. They were too old to be in the war, or too young to be in the wars. My dad was born in 1908, and the war was in 1916, and so he would have only been 8 years old, 8, 9, 10, and then in the Second World War, he would have been too old. So it was too young for the First World War and too old for the Second World War.
So what were the ages that you could be to be in the war?
You could be, well, a lot of young men lied about their age because they wanted to serve their country. And so they would say they were 18, but they were like 15, 16 and lied about their age so that they could go and serve their country. My father, for whatever reason, and he never discussed it about ever going into the service. Like I said, he was too young for that, for the First World War. And in the Second World War, we had 5 kids, so we had 4. I was born in 39, and my sister was born in 1940, and my other sister was not born until 1948. So, but he didn't serve in the war. But he did serve here in the United States, and what they had during the Second World War was a program called. The title escapes me, but they did service projects in every city throughout the United States, and they would like build roads, or they would clean areas, get rid of brush and whatever. So just about every person served the war in some way, either locally or as a service person. And my mom was a riveter during the Second World War. My mom worked in the shipyard, and she literally had a screwdriver and put screws into ships. Everett, where we lived, had a shipyard, and they had a certain aspect of the building of the ships there. And my mom worked there throughout the Second World War in the shipyard. And there was just an article in the paper the other day about Rosie the Riveter, and they all had these bandanas that they wore to work. They all wore dresses, wore a dress to work, and they had a bandana that covered their hair. And they worked 5-6 days a week at the shipyard. And my mom was one of them.
So, where did your great-grandfather that moved to San Francisco move from?
He moved from Germany. He moved from the Danish-German border near Hamburg, Germany. All of my father's family was from that area. And as soon as they could, from California, they moved to the Oregon, Washington, or what's called Oregon Territory then, and they moved into the eastern Washington area and settled in Odessa and Harrington area. And all of my great-grandpa and my grandfather's property is there. And your parents have this big plat book that shows both sides of your grandparents on your grandpa's side and on my side of properties that were owned there, the farming areas in that area, or Odessa, Harrington, Reardon area.
That is Lincoln County, right?
Right.
Okay. And did you have any family members in any other war besides World War One?
Yes. My mother's 2 brothers served in the Second World War. My uncle, my mother's the second sibling, her older brother, he was younger than she, but he was an officer in the Second World War. He went in as a second lieutenant. He was a college graduate, and so if you were a college graduate, you went in as an officer, and he rose to the rank of colonel during the war. And when he was finished with the war, he spent a year, and I've forgotten how many months, in a hospital in New Zealand. He was stationed in the Philippines, and he was one And I'm sorry to say I don't know which island he was on, but he was one that did one of those marches, um, and he was um, injured. He had a broken back, had a broken leg, a lot of mental anguish, and he spent a lot of time. He was like taken by ship, and when the fleets came in and rescued these guys, and he went to New Zealand, and he was nursed back to health there, and one of the nurses he fell in love with, my Aunt Joan, and he married her and brought her here to Everett, Washington, where they raised 3 children, and every 3 years he would take her back to New Zealand. It was a promise he made that he would always take her back. And he would not discuss his war years at all. It was too traumatic for him. And so I think that he probably went through hell. And but he served in the National Guard. Yeah, it was National Guard, and he rose to the rank of I've forgotten, not general, but right below general. I think it was like colonel. And so when he retired, he continued to serve as in a post of that, and always was an active veteran. My mother's youngest brother, Bill, was also in the Philippines, but he was a Seabee, SCABEE, and those fellows were the construction workers building dormitories, building barracks, building storage supply houses. And so they were kind of the front runners of the army, and in the to get things set up for the troops to come in. And he also was captured, and he ended up having a lot of getting a lot of diseases, the yellow fever, and all kinds of diseases that were rampant in those hot southern areas. So he also spent a lot of time in a hospital, but he was not airlifted, but he was sent back, and he was in Rhode Island, and so he spent a lot of time in and out of sanitariums in the on the East Coast. And while there, he met a woman named Rosie, and they married. He was 39, and she died of some infectious disease that one of the soldiers brought back, like within 4 or 5 months of their marriage. So then he came back to the West Coast, to the Everett area, and he went to work as a carpenter, and he worked in Seattle. And there's a building in Seattle. Its claim to fame was every unit had a corner window. That building is still there. And when my Uncle Bill was working on that, he fell from the top of that building all the way down, and there happened to be a tarp thing that would have been like a trampoline, and he went up and down and up and down, and he broke his back, and he was in the Veterans Hospital near the freeway in Seattle, and he was there over 3 years, learning to walk again. It smashed his vocal cords as well, and so he had learned to talk and breathe on his own, and it was just a miracle that he lived. So he was, like, I think he was 39 when he met and married his wife, and she, on their wedding night, contracted, or had, and they discovered it, tuberculosis, and ended up 2.5 years in a TB sanitarium in Stonehenge. So it was about 2.5 years before they even started a family, but they did end up having a family. But he would talk about the Second World War because his job was very interesting, and he never once carried a gun, not even a knife. And so they had a lot of protection, but they were captured as well at the end. And they weren't tortured because they didn't have any weapons, and the Japanese respected that they weren't going to try and kill them, so they didn't have as harsh a treatment.
What was his job in the war?
He was he works at carpenter construction.
How did living during the war affect your life?
Oh my goodness. Well, I was just small. I was 7 when the war ended, but I do remember it. I remember that we had rations. I remember that we had, you couldn't get butter, you couldn't get, there were a lot of things my mom couldn't get, no women could get nylons. And if you happened to have a pair of nylons, you found some woman that would like repair your nylons for you. And we had a neighbor across the alley from us that was what she did for a living. She would repair nylons for women, and they would just like be full of little sewing things. And some of them were pretty intricate and patched up, but women loved to wear nylons. But we didn't have butter, and I can remember that we had these things, it's called margarine, and it came in a clear plastic, and it was white. And in the middle of the package was this thing you pressed, and it exploded, and it was yellow dye. And so you had to squeeze it. So we would pass that, we would throw it across the table at each other, and it took about 10 minutes for you to mix this up. And then sometimes it exploded, and you'd have margarine everywhere, and it was like yucky. And we ate that. It had absolutely no flavor, but it was yellow, and so it was like similar to butter. It looked like butter, and that's what we used. And at the grocery store, we had taxes, and so they gave you these, what they were called tax tokens, and they were like a silver color. And so, and I don't remember, I think it was, you weren't taxed until 11 cents, I think. So say it was 10 or 11 cents, and so you had to have a tax token. If you didn't, he would take a penny and give you 2 tax tokens back. So a penny was worth 3 tax tokens. So everybody used those, and that again was because coins and copper and all of those kind of minerals that we needed for the war effort were in great demand. So they used other things to make coins and money for us. And the other thing I can remember about that time was going around my neighborhood. My father's backyard was a big garden, and I would go around my neighborhood selling vegetables and fruits and whatever to earn money for different things.
And living during a time where tuberculosis was a big deal, how cautious did you have to be not to get it?
Oh my. I was too little to know how infectious it was until I was older and I was going to nursing school. But when I was little, after the wedding, and when my aunt was put in the TB sanitarium in Snohomish, the only way my uncle could first visit with her was through the window. He'd have to stand outside because he couldn't go inside, and there was a screen there which probably wouldn't have protected, but my aunt was in the bed, and we always had to be, my mother and my siblings and I would go to visit with my uncle sometimes, and we'd stand outside this window and talk to my Aunt Grace through the window. Finally, certain people, if you were the partner or the spouse of the patient, and sometimes the children, you could don a really heavy duty a mask and robed up in laboratory type clothing that protected you, and nothing could have any part of your skin exposed. And then you could go in, but you weren't allowed to touch the patient, and you had to be a certain amount of space away from the bed. And but it was touch and go for those patients. My aunt was there for 2.5 years, and during that time, she barely made it some of the time. It was really bad, and so it was highly contagious, and or at least they thought it was then, and that was the course of treatment was isolation. It was terrible. They would put the nurses could come into the room if they were like really garbed up, but the patient had to empty their own waste, and the food was delivered and put through just like you were in a prison through had a little door on each side, and the patient would take the food that they had inside of that, and then they would put it back there, and then I don't know how they sterilized it, but they must have had some way of doing that, or they threw it away. I don't know. I don't remember that part, but it was a bad time for people that contracted that. There were a lot of diseases during the time I was growing up that were really prevalent. Polio was another one, and my brother contracted polio when he was 10 years old, and we lived in a house that had an upstairs, and he wasn't physically able to get down the stairs, and if my dad carried him down, he could get down, but he was pretty much in isolation as well, and a young boy that was just down the street from us 2 blocks was in an iron lung. So my brother was very fortunate that he didn't have to be in an iron lung, but it was a long, slow process, and he was 10 then, and he was really short, and when he graduated from high school, after he graduated, when he was in the service, then he grew about 3 inches, so it was after high school that he finally grew again.
Oh. How were your experiences in, like, growing up in, like, high school and college? What was that like for you in that time?
Well, for the most part, women, young girls like me, a career wasn't important. Especially, I grew up in the blue collar side of where I lived in Everett was a real class town. We lived on a certain side of the main road of town, Broadway. Most of all of those people were blue collar workers, meaning that they worked in factories or shipyards or mills, and so it wasn't an expectation for a girl to go to college. On the other side of Broadway, and maybe even just a few blocks up, and going towards the water, those people were more affluent and had a little more money, and their parents had probably gone to college. Neither of my parents had gone to college, and it was an expectation for those kids that that's what they were going to do. Mostly in those days, there weren't scholarships to be had. I wanted to go to nursing school, and there wasn't a scholarship for me, and so my uncle, my dad's brother, was going to loan me the tuition. He had to live at the hospital, and so my dad was very proud, and we went to the bank, and my uncle was going to put the money into an account, into my mother account for my mother. They didn't even have a checking account in those days. They did everything by cash. And my father had to sign, and he stormed out and refused to sign. And at the time, it was devastating for me, but later on, I realized that that had to be really hard for him, that he didn't have the money to do it, and he did not want charity at all. And so that was very hard. So I didn't get to go that year. I got to do all of the preliminary things other than I worked at the hospital, and I took a few of the classes that you didn't have to stay and live there, but that's all the further I got. So it was just, some kids did get some private colleges did offer scholarships in those early days, and but mostly the kids that went to college were expected to go. It was a family thing that they had talked about. It's like we talk about that now with our kids and with our grandkids, and it's an expectation that that's just part of your life. That wasn't the way it was when I was growing up. That wasn't. My father thought girls only went to college to find a man. He had no concept that you would go to college to have a career.
Oh. So, how many brothers or sisters did your father have, and what were they like?
My father had a younger brother. He was the youngest of the family, and he had 3 sisters. And none of them, my father went through 8th grade. His 3 sisters went through 6th grade, and the youngest had 1 year of junior college in Everett. There was an Everett Community College, wasn't called Community College then. And so that was their education. And they were totally against women having a career. They were a very strong, stubborn German family. They thought women's place was in the home. No woman worked outside the home. No woman could have a job that would be better than her husband's job, if she even had a job. They're primarily were there to take care of the husband and the kids. And that was ingrained in all of my cousins and all of my family. And that was, and my mother had gone to college, but my father berated her for that because it was not something that he thought was they were supposed to do, and that's the way that my father's side of the family felt. My mother's side of the family, all of my cousins finished college, every single one of them. And they never had any scholarships. They just said that was an expectation, and they lived. My uncle, my one cousin's family, he owned an electrical store. He'd gone to college. My aunt, my grandma's sister, had gone to college. My grandmother's other sister was a teacher. My grandmother's youngest sister was a writer, and she was a piano teacher, but she also went to college. But it wasn't an expectation in the way I grew up, but it was on my mother's side and not my father's.
Where did your Uncle Bill's wife work at?
She was the buyer for, and I can't, it was like the Bon Marché before it was it may have been called the Bon Marché then, I just don't know, but she worked in Seattle. She was a college graduate as well, brilliant. She was the buyer for the Seattle store, big department store in Seattle, and then they opened up a branch in Tacoma and one in Everett, and so she trained those employees to do the same type of job that she did.
Did you ever end up finishing college?
No. I went when I was 37, I went back to school for 2 years at a junior college, and I went there to go back to nursing school and become a nurse, and there was a program called medical assistant, and primarily you worked in a doctor's office when you got out, and it was 24 credit hours, and you could finish in 2 years versus the 3 years it would take to go to nursing school. And so I chose that route, and because I had your father, who was just like 7 years old, so I chose to go that way.
At what age did you get married, and where did you live at the time?
With Grandpa, or my first marriage.
Your first marriage.
Oh dear. Well, I was very young. I was only 18, just right straight out of school, and I lived in Everett. And I was going to Everett Junior College to try and get some credits to go to nursing school. But at that point, you had to live at the hospital, and I was married, and so that was out for me. But there were other jobs in the hospital you could do You could work in the dietitian's offices, which I did, and so that's what I did. I always wanted to be in that hospital setting and be with patients, and so that's what I did. That's where I worked, Everett General Hospital.
And when you were young and just married, were you like, what was your income like?
Oh my goal was to get 85 cents an hour. I was making 65 cents an hour, and it was in 1958. And I thought, if I could just make 85 cents an hour, you could just get all, just like, it would just be amazing. So that was my goal, was to make 85 cents an hour.
How much at that time could 85 cents buy you?
Well, a loaf of bread was probably 5 for $1. If you, most of there were not very many grocery chains then. There was a Safeway store out South Everett, but most of the grocery stores were little corner grocery stores, like the one that's out there on the corner of Mullen, and just about everybody had a grocery account, and so you'd buy your groceries on credit. And then they were just starting to get away from that when I was young and when I was first married. But you could buy, hamburger was 25 cents a pound. Milk everything was around 25 cents, I think. You didn't splurge on a whole lot of stuff. Campbell's soup, tomato soup was probably you could make Campbell's tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, and that would be a really good dinner when you were like towards the end of the month. But yeah, and even when I moved down here to the Lacey area in '66, my grocery bill was high. Well, I thought high, and it was like $25 a week. That was my grocery budget. So that was in the '60s. So 1966, I was paying $25 a week for groceries, and sometimes I would go over that, and it would just be, oh, I can't believe I did that. So it was just like, but you didn't get paid more. Your grandpa, when he went to work for the Attorney General's office, his goal was to make $10,000 a year, and that was his goal. And he had graduated from high school, college, and 3 years of law school, and he succeeded in doing that. But he spent a lot of years going to school to do that. So, but a lot of people go through a lot of years of school and don't make that kind of money either. They're still hard put to pay the grocery bill.
What were your brothers and sisters like growing up?
My very best friend was my brother, who was 3.5 years older than I. We were inseparable. I was a tomboy. He was an extremely good athlete. He was left-handed, as I was, but he could like bat left. He was forgot what you call that.
Switch hitter.
Switch hitter. He was always small. He had had scarlet fever as a young boy. He had every childhood disease: the measles, the mumps, the chicken pox, all of those. So he was very short. He was very small and very thin. And he was a very finicky eater. And in fact, if anything touched anything else on his plate, he wouldn't eat it. He wouldn't eat anything then. So he would just go without. And but he was an incredible ball player, and he was excellent basketball player. And we'd make our own basketball court in our backyard, and we didn't have a cement thing. We had it out. It was like a chicken coop converted into a little basketball court, and so it was. I don't even think it was gravel. It was just dirt and weeds and whatever. And he taught me how to play basketball and do lay-ups and and but in those days, girls were not allowed to play sports in school. And my brother refused to try out. He was so shy that he never tried out for any. They didn't have like little league and sports that weren't involved in school, so you could sign up and not have. But he never would go to any of the tryouts, or he just was too shy to do it. And he was excellent. So when he was an adult, he played in a softball league he lived in Marysville, and he played softball until he was 76 years old, and he had prostate cancer, so he did, 73 years old. He died at 73. But he was excellent, and everybody knew who he was, and he was a runner till his knees gave out. He was just incredible, and I patterned myself after him. My older brother was 7 years older than I. We never got along. He was a bully. He was extremely mean. He was a very selfish person, and we all tried to avoid him. We did not want to be around him. He was mean. And the only time he was nice is if he wanted a favor, if he wanted you to scrub out the bathtub so he could take a bath. But he was just, he was not a nice person, and I never got along with him, ever.
What about your sisters?
Oh, well, my sisters, I have a sister that's 18 months younger than I, and until my other sister came along 8 years later, my sister and I we were very close, but I, like I said, was more outside wanting to play sports and whatever, and my sister didn't want to do anything. She liked to do paper dolls and color and stay in the house, and we didn't have TV, so that wasn't an issue. But so to get her outside so that because you needed 3 people lots of times for some of the games that my brother and I wanted to play. So we'd try to talk her into coming outside to play, and she'd say she would do it, and then she would say she'd forget something, and she'd go back in, and then she'd lock the door and wouldn't come out. And so we couldn't get her to come out. So we ended up finally finding other kids in the neighborhood to help us play knock up and lay down. We called that. That was a baseball game that you lay the bat down in the middle of the street, and then the person hits the ball, and you need to stay on the street, and the street's not very wide, and you hit the ball, and then the person, if they catch it, then they're up. But if you don't catch it, then you roll the ball towards the bat, and then the person that had hit tries to, if it hits the bat, tries to catch the ball before as it bounces up over the bat. It's a very fun game. We played that by the hour. We played football between our yards, and now when I look at that little house, that little patch of grass was not really wide enough for a football field, and I can see now why our neighbor was really upset when we play out there, because it's really close to his windows.
Is your house still there?
Yes. Yes. When I was in 9th grade, going to high school, I refused to go to high school because our house had never been painted, and it was just like you'd look at a movie of those houses down in the South that they're just like, they're just like kind of, well, not falling down, but the wood is unfinished and whatever, and they're just like dark, and this porch went clear across. This was a porch that I'll show you pictures tomorrow. A porch that we sat on, and it had rocking chairs out there and whatever. But so my brother's best friend Dale's father owned a paint store. So my brother and we picked berries and picked corn and beans and whatever all summer long, and we'd save our money and we bought paint to paint the house. And we knew that my dad didn't want to paint the house because he thought that would raise the taxes. And so, and my thought was, I'm not going to high school and, be so embarrassed with this house. It's a mess. And, I mean, it looked awful. And so we just, and our friend Dale came over, and so the three of us just started in. And we're up here painting on this roof ledge when my father came home from work. And we had a ladder coming up. This was a porch here, and a ladder coming up. And he came up on that ladder, and he grabbed my brother, and he was so mad. And then all of a sudden, he just thought, we don't know what happened. He just looked, and he just like grabbed a paintbrush, and he started to help us. And so we had our house painted. This is a siding that's on there now, but.
When was this picture taken?
Oh. After Nana passed away, because this was a ramp, so this was probably taken in probably 1980.
Did she still live there?
She lived there. She died in 1984. So this was after 84. Nana died in 84. And my dad built a ramp here, and it came like this and over, and you can see where this was growing grass in there after he took the ramp down. And then the door to get in the house was here. This all wasn't here. Our living room in this house, there are 5 kids lived in that house. It was a 1-bedroom house.
Man.
And our living room was literally 9 by 12, which is a sheet of linoleum. We call it linoleum, like you call it tile now, but 9 by you probably don't want to have that down there, but 9 by 12. That was the size of our living room, and then our kitchen was about the size of my kitchen, and then there was a bedroom in the front, and then this was housed a hot water tank. And it was supposedly like a closet. It was smaller than this room, where my sister and I shared a bedroom, bunk beds. And on the end of our bunk beds were a chest of drawers. And then upstairs was this dormer, and you could only stand up right in here. So you had to crawl to get onto the beds on the sides.
And that's where your brother stayed when you had polio?
My brother, there's a back side of that. My brother Bill always had the front bedroom. Well, it wasn't a bedroom, but there was my dad built a separate little closet type thing there. And my brother David was on that side. And then some of the time I was on a cot on that side, and my mom was in another cot thing on the other side, when we all lived upstairs. Sometimes when my dad would be mean.
Oh.
So we all lived upstairs. Except for him. He lived in this bedroom.
Oh.
He lived in that bedroom by himself from the time I was little.
Oh.
Most of the time.
What were your experiences getting down to the Lacey area?
Well, I met your grandpa. One of my good friends was a bowler. I bowled with my brother. And his good friend, Eddie Hansen, was the mayor of Everett. And he had gone to law school with your grandpa. And he said, I have someone I want you to meet. And he said, I think you two would get along really well. So I said, oh, I'm not interested, because I had been married before and I wasn't really interested in that. But I said, oh, okay. So he came up and we went to a movie. Well, I was working in the lab at Scott Paper Company at the time, and I got called into work when he was on his way up to Everett. So I had to go to work. And so he, I think, thought that I was just making that up. But he decided to call one more time, and then from then on, we just hit it off. And so then he was in law school. He was in his last year of law school. So he graduated in June, and he was going to work for the Attorney General's office here in Olympia. And so he moved down here in August, and we were going to get married the following Easter. And when he got out of college, out of law school, he was going to be drafted. It was the Vietnam War. And so he applied to the JAG Corps, which is a officers thing, and so he was going to do that, and then we decided to get married before the end of the year, and then he never went into the service, so that was.
Did you decide to get married so that he wouldn't have to go into the?
No. Well, I don't. Well, that entered our minds for sure. But I had 3 kids and he had 1, so we had 4 kids. So that precluded him from having to go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. If you didn't have any kids and you weren't married, you automatically were drafted.
Oh. And what was your job once you moved down to Lacey?
In Lacey. Well, when I lived in Everett for a while, we had a small grocery store. And so when I went through a divorce, the grocery store, we had to sell it. And so when I married your grandpa and we moved to Lacey, I was on unemployment. And so in those days, and it may still be that way, every week you had to go to the unemployment office and you had to tell them how many businesses you tried to get a job. And so every week on my way to the unemployment office in downtown Olympia, I stopped at the Safeway store going into Olympia. I think it was, or coming out of Olympia, I think. And it's now the City Hall, Olympia City Hall, and it was a Safeway store. And it was the district office of Safeway. And so I would trudge up those steps up there into the back where the office manager was every week. And she got really tired of seeing me, and she'd say, I told you I don't have a job for you. And every week she'd say the same thing. And I said, well, you know, I have to do this in order to comply with the rules of unemployment, but I really would like to work for Safeway. I love this store, you know, blah, 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 blah. And so one day I went in, and it was just about Christmas, and I had just got hired at a candy cane. I had to take something, so the unemployment office said I had to take a job, and at that point it didn't have to be what I had done, but they were told that people had to be gainfully employed, and so in order for me to still get benefits, I had to take a job that was even beneath what I wanted to do. So I went to work for this candy cane, Stone's Candy Cane Factory, and it was out on Martin Way. When you come up Carpenter Road, it's Stone. It was a Catholic community hall right there now, but then it was a candy cane factory. So I'd only worked there about a week. And it was awful. And during that time, I kept getting promoted because just about everybody there was just like, you know, didn't have a brain practically. It was just like really bad. And so anyway, so I thought, I'm just going to go back into that Safeway store one more time. And so I went in there, and she said, I was going to call you. One of our employees is moving, and we have a spot for you. So I went home, and she said, could I start the next day? And I said, yes. So I went home and I called that candy cane factory, and then I worked at Safeway until I got pregnant with your father. And in those days, working in a retail place, you couldn't work there and be pregnant and showing. I mean, they had a lot of discrimination then, and so I couldn't work there. And when I couldn't get my buttons buttoned on my uniform, then I had to quit.
Oh. What was your job after the Safeway?
After the Safeway, I didn't work for a while. Then I went back to school for a couple of years, and then I got a job working at radiation oncology, and I worked there for 15 years. And it was in Olympia next to the hospital, and I was the office manager. When I first started there was the young doctor who was still finishing up his schooling at the U, the technician, and me. So there were 3 of us back there. And when I quit there in 1991, after there were 64 employees there. So really grew. That's how much cancer there
Yeah.
was.
And where did your husband work?
My husband, your grandpa, was the Lacey city attorney. Before that, he worked for the attorney general's office, and then he went to work with a fellow in Lacey who was the city attorney. And in those days, the city attorney had to run for election, and his partner, he became a partner in this two-man firm, wanted to move out to the Bay, wanted to live out in the Squally Bay area and a house on the Sound. And you had to live in the city of Lacey. You had to live in the city in which you were a city attorney. And so your grandpa took over that position and then had to run for election. And he ran for election 2 times, won both times. And then it became an appointed position, and he never had to run again. And then the city manager called the shots. And so from then on, you were an employee of the city. But your grandpa was only a part-time city attorney, meaning that half the time he spent as a city attorney and half the time he had private practice. And so he did that for 43 years.
I have a few follow-up questions. What were the marches in the Philippines about? When your uncle?
My uncles were there. The Japanese at that point were starting to lose the war, and they could feel it. The war in Europe was ending. It was 1945, and Hitler was defeated, and the Japanese were still being aggressive, and they, for whatever reasons, decided that they were not going to have, they were not going to let the Americans save these prisoners. And so on some of these islands, Bataan and Iwo Jima and in the Marshall Islands, I think one of my uncles is in the Marshall Islands. And so they were trying to, they marched them on foot. They were on foot. And if you fell, you either were shot or just left to die. As there were more and more bombings by American airplanes and Australian and British and whatever were coming, because their war effort was finished pretty much in Europe, so they were going to help us and a lot of those islands down there were not just U.S. They were owned by Great Britain. They were owned by France, and they were owned by Spain and whatever. So all of those countries where the Japanese had invaded and taken over these islands in the South Pacific, they were heading there to save those islands and get that territory back. And the Japanese just decided that, if her history serves me well, decided that they weren't going to have survivors. And we had bombed Hiroshima, they call it now, but it's Hiroshima, the Japanese, 2 big cities in Japan with atomic bombs. And when my uncles were being marched, well, my youngest uncle was being marched, they had just bombed Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, I always call it that. And they, first of all, mowed everybody down, or with swords and whatever, those that were service people that had uniforms on. And those that were construction workers like my uncle and the Seabees, for whatever reason, they didn't think that they were a threat, but they weren't going to leave them there to be saved either. And so I don't really know what their purpose was for this march, whether it was to let them just like fall like flies after, but a lot of those Seabees, almost all of the Seabees survived. and where my other uncle was, and I don't remember the island he was on for sure. I don't remember. Should, but anyway, when he fell, he was saved by other bodies falling on him, and before they could finish those guys off, they were invaded by our guys and so our guys came in, and it was just about that time that a big battle, and they executed the Japanese enough to save, and my uncle just happened to be saved by bodies being on top of him. So it was pretty traumatic. And so he would, and that's about as much as we could get from him, because he really didn't want to talk about it, because he was an officer. And so one of the things that we found from just the history, if you were an officer and trying to protect your troops and your men, you were subjected to a lot of cruelty, and your privates and sergeants and whatever underneath you were like marched out in front of you and, you know, beheaded and shot and tortured and whatever. And I think it was probably just unspeakable. And so he didn't really talk about it. The only thing we really know is from watching movie films, you know, of those different islands later on. It was pretty bad. I don't know what, it'd be interesting to go back and read what possessed the Japanese to march those people. Why didn't they just mow them down? We don't know. I don't know anyway. I don't know. And now it's amazing to me that with all the atrocities of that we are really close to the Japanese. Again, we're their ally. So it's just the way wars are. They're bad.
Did your great-grandfather have any struggles going around the Horn, or that you know of?
I don't know. He didn't write about it. My great-grandmother wrote about coming by covered wagon, and so my cousins, I never got any of that. I wasn't privy to. I mean, I can remember as a kid, and I wasn't that much interested in it, you know, in listening to it, which I would be now. But they would talk about it and whatever, and they'd read all these papers, and so I don't know. I don't know if he wrote much about it, and in those days, he really didn't send letters much. It was just too. I mean, you made journal. He had a journal, I would imagine, but my great-grandmother for sure, because she was a writer, and so she, and my grandmother too. In fact, I've come across some of my grandmother's writings on little day trips she'd taken Everett, and how she'd get all dressed up to go for a ride.
So, I think that concludes the interview. Thank you.
You're welcome. I've talked a lot, but hope you got something from that.
Yeah.